All right, well, welcome everybody to this series of our Bone and Joint Institute Showcase series. Today we have a session with Dr. Harvi Hart and Dr. Jesse Charlton, both with some overlapping themes related to wearable technologies to manage or to measure gait parameters. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Harvi Hart, who's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Physical Therapy at Western. Harvi received her PhD from the University of Melbourne in Australia, and Harvi's research is focused on knee injuries and knee osteoarthritis with the overarching theme to understand the biomechanical mechanisms of injury and disease and to use that information to develop and test approaches to improve symptoms and function. Harvi's also interested in using remote telemetry technology to further understand gait characteristics in free living. My name is Pamukoff. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Kinesiology, and I'm just serving as the chair and moderator of this session. Harvi's talk today is called Hey, Take It Outside, using wearable technology to track gait parameters and monitor intervention, adherence, and free living. If you do have any questions that pop up as we go, I'll keep track of them in the chat, and then we can circle back to those as we get to that. Okay, so Harvi, I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Derek. Hi, everyone. So today, I'll first start off with a brief overview of wearable technology, and then I'll talk about two studies that we are currently in planning phases that are using wearable sensors. So gait parameters are associated with various health markers. For example, walking speed is considered as a sixth vital sign. It offers insights into patients' functional capacity as well as general health. And we can use these variables as indicators that to predict future events such as disability. Walking cadence is another gait parameter that can provide important information. For example, walking at 100 steps per minute, it's a suggested proxy threshold for moderate intensity physical activity, and 130 steps per minute is the threshold for vigorous intensity activity. So my research is focused on knee osteoarthritis, which is a major contributor to walking difficulty. It is one of the most common reasons for becoming physically inactive with age. We know that people with knee osteoarthritis often walk with lower cadence, so that means that they take fewer steps per minute, and they also walk more slowly. So my research has shown that lower cadence is associated with greater worsening of osteoarthritis over time. And also lower cadence is associated with greater loads per step in people with knee osteoarthritis when you control for their walking speed. So in a lab setting, in addition to accurately tracking gait parameters, we can also easily manipulate those. For example, changing cadence, you can use a metronome or verbal cues to get someone to take more shorter steps while controlling other factors. So in a lab-based study, I asked people with knee osteoarthritis to walk at a higher beat. So they were walking at a 10% higher cadence than their usual walking cadence while fixing their gait speed. So that study showed that adopting a higher cadence whilst maintaining a fixed walking speed reduces knee loads. So while the well-controlled lab environment offers great advantages as we're able to control and manipulate gait parameters precisely, there are some drawbacks of tracking gait in a lab-based environment. So, for example, in a lab-based setting, when we conduct gait assessments, the pathways are often clean and flat and short, so it's more difficult to measure the variability in walking that we usually experience when we're walking outside. And there's also that increased attention when performing a task in a lab-based setting. So whereas in a real world, we're often distracted and there are very sensory conditions that may result in worse gait impairments during daily living than what we see in a lab. Also, patients may mask their problems or exaggerate them when walking in a short walking distance offered in a lab setting. Accessibility is also a concern, so we need to consider availability of the lab, the technicians when booking participants in. So this does limit who can be included in our research studies. Also, lab technology is not available at clinics. Gait assessments at a discrete moment in a lab setting may not necessarily reflect functional everyday mobility. So ecological validity of lab-based studies may be limited. So gait assessments in the lab and outside of the lab both provide important but different information. So gait assessment in the lab reflects a person's capacity, so what they can do, whereas gait during daily living reflects more of a person's functional performance, so what they're actually doing. So how do we bridge the gap between lab, where we are really good at conducting gait assessments, and real life, where we also hope to move our research to? So advances in technology offer us opportunities to track gait parameters in real world. So over the past few years, wearable technology has gone beyond the lab setting and into the public domain. And they do offer several advantages. So when tracking gait outside of the lab setting, it's an environment that better mimics true environment where the participants are active in. So usually in a lab we have limited space, but when collecting data outside, this is not the case. We can collect data over longer distances and capture variations that are part of everyday living. So in a lab, we usually collect data during a limited number of activities. So the use of wearable sensors can allow us to capture data during a range of activities that are part of everyday living. And also these devices offer us opportunities to build large data sets in a lab. So we can collect, in a lab, we can collect small amount of data, but with wearable sensors, we can collect data over days if we wanted to. And this can also reduce barriers to participation. So we're restricted by accessibility of the lab, and also the participants may or may not be able to come in for lab visits over multiple follow-up points, but wearable sensors can reduce those barriers. So sensor technology can facilitate gait tracking outside of a lab, but as with any emerging technology, the purpose-specific utility of these wearable sensors do need to be determined before they can be used. So we talked about some of the advantages of wearable sensors. There are also things that we do need to consider when using wearable sensors. So not all sensors are created equal. So there are variations in the sensors and their alignment, in their manufacturer calibration process, also the location of sensor placement, type of attachment. These can all affect the data, and we need to be aware of the potential variations in the quality of data and the process outcomes. It is reasonable to assume that use of wearable technology outside in the real world will result in more variations. So variations in conditions such as surfaces, elevations, stair height. So we would also expect walking bouts to be less constant than what we see in a lab setting. So the quality of data obtained will vary according to the parameter specificities. Studies have reported excellent validity and reliability of wearable sensors for measuring mean gait parameters during level walking in a lab setting, but little is known about the reliability and validity of wearable sensors in the real world. Also, it is possible to obtain reliable gait parameters with different gait analysis systems across multiple gait labs, but reliability of gait parameters measured with wearable sensors across multiple sites, it's unknown. Okay, so the first study that we have, it's focused on reliability and accuracy of wearables to track gait parameters outside of the lab. So we are in the early stages of this project, but I wanted to share with you what we've got planned for this study. So we do have a transdisciplinary group working on this project. So the team includes researchers from 4 universities. We have neuroscientists, biomechanists, engineers with expertise in wearable technology and data analysis. So based on my previous research, I am interested in gait parameters such as cadence, or others in the team are interested in other gait parameters or predicting joint kinematics and moments. So to start off with, we have decided to focus on these 3 questions. First, whether it is possible to assess gait parameters with wearable sensors across multiple sites using a standardized protocol. Also, can wearable sensors reliably and accurately monitor and measure gait parameters during various activities of daily living? And how does gait parameters data estimated from wearable sensors compare with data collected in a lab setting? So for this pilot project, we are including 2 types of wearable sensors. So the first one is the Actigraph GT9X Link. So it's a commercially available wearable device. It includes different types of inertial sensors. And so the cost for these devices is about $600 plus software licensing fee. And the second device is our in-house custom-built 3D printed IMU designed by one of our collaborators, Dr. Holsworth. So it also includes different types of inertial sensors and it can be configured to be attached to any anatomical location. And the cost to put these devices together is approximately $50. So this study, we are focusing on healthy individuals. So we will select a route which includes different surfaces such as stairs, uneven, level, incline, decline surfaces. And we plan to map out similar courses at other sites with variations in walking surfaces. So the participants will complete the route on 2 separate days while wearing the 2 different types of sensors. So whilst walking with the wearable sensors, we will also record on camera their lower limb body movements during the course, and we'll use that to determine accuracy. In a subset of these individuals, we also aim to do gait analysis in a lab setting, and then explore the differences in variability of gait parameters collected in a lab with a gait analysis system and outside with the wearable sensors. So we're hoping that this study will reveal some important findings. So it will reveal the reliability and accuracy of 2 different types of sensors to track gait parameters outside of the lab. So one commercially available and one custom built. It will also reveal to what extent walking in a lab is a good indicator of walking in the real world. Also the reliability across sites. So we have 4 sites for this project. So this is especially relevant when we want to consider combining data sets in the future or conducting multi-center studies using wearable sensors. And we'll also find out how well the 3D printed device performs in the real world. So the custom built device will offer additional advantages. So it's low cost, so it would be easy enough to use that for large multi-center trials in the future. Okay, so the second study will also use wearable sensors. But this one will focus on using the wearable sensors to monitor adherence to an intervention. So this study is funded by a BJI Catalyst grant. So as I mentioned before, knee OA is a leading cause of disability. The medial knee osteoarthritis is particularly common, and medial OA is especially common in the presence of varus alignment because of its loading, because of the effects of joint loading. So normal gait biomechanics includes an external knee adduction moment during stance, which distributes more load on the medial compartment relative to the lateral. The moment is mainly determined by the ground reaction factor here, and its lever arm, so just the blue line here. So knee adduction moment increases when walking with a greater varus alignment, and it's also associated with higher pain, disability, and joint damage. Unloader knee braces are proposed to improve pain, function, and delay osteoarthritis progression. They're supposed to provide a valgus moment during walking to counteract that large varus moment, and also provides stability and proprioception. But the clinical guidelines are regarding brace shoes they vary, some recommending them, others not. So we do need a more rigorous clinical trial to evaluate the effects of unloader brace. The issue with bracing is that adherence to bracing use is suggested to be a key element affecting the efficacy. But there is a large variability in the reported adherence rates. So it's been reported that it ranges from 0% to 76%. So usually information regarding brace wear time, it's obtained from questionnaires or patient diaries, but people may not recall their brace wear time accurately or adhere to prescribed brace wear time in the same way. So we do need more objective measures of brace wear time. So that kind of led to this question: can we instrument unloader knee braces to monitor adherence to their use? So this device is the one that we are planning on using in the first study. So we did approach Dr. Holsworth and his team to see if these devices could be potentially used to track brace wear time. And they've designed multiple prototypes that we might be able to use to track brace wear time. And we also wanted to make sure that they're not going to be super bulky and they could be attached to the brace. So they have designed an INU for us that wakes up from a low power sleep state when it detects an acceleration of 0.30 millimeters per second square, seconds missing. So it records timestamps and accumulates step count. And when there is no acceleration for 15 seconds, the step count and the timestamp, it's saved on a SD card before it goes back to its low sleep state. So we do have some data just collected as part of developing the prototype. So the top, so figure A is the step count and the figure B is the active time. So what so all the spikes where we have the spikes, it's the time when the acceleration is over 0.3 meters per second square, and then top is during that time the steps that they're taking. So another point that further kind of complicates the brace issue is that there are many different types of braces, and they vary in costs and Also, we don't know whether the benefits of the bracing is due to the improved stability and proprioception of having a brace on, or it's more from that unloading mechanism. So we, to conduct a more rigorous clinical trial, we do need an appropriate sham brace that we could use in that trial. So our second question for this study is, can we design an appropriate sham brace that kind of looks identical to the unloader brace? So what we essentially wanted to do was keep the stability and the proprioception component of the unloader brace, but we wanted disable that 3-point bending mechanism, so it's not providing the unloading. So we've gone through a few different strap configurations and figuring out what the best way is to do that. And this is what we've kind of come up as the easiest and the simplest way is using the same straps, but the straps are actually not crossing the knees. So you don't get that 3-point bending mechanism that's the unloader brace provides. So the overall aim for the study is to conduct a small crossover design RCT comparing the unloader effects of a true custom fit unloader brace versus a sham brace. And that's instrumented with custom built wearable sensors. So there are two things that we are hoping to confirm with this study. Firstly, the suitability of the sham unloader brace, and also the proper functioning of wearable sensors. So far, we have got ethics, and we've got an IMU prototype, figured out the sham brace design, collected some data with the prototype. So the next steps would be to confirm to make sure that the unloading mechanism is disabled in the sham brace and start with the recruitment process. Are eventually looking ahead, what we intend to do is conduct our CIHR funded pilot RCT to determine the feasibility of a multi-center sham controlled trial. So the two studies that I've presented here that we're planning on doing, they all started off with, I guess I received some funding from Canadian MSK Rehab Network as a travel board to attend the UBC Wearables Summer School, and that's where we formed some of these connections, which led to the first study that I talked about. We received small funding grant from Western, and we were able to form collaborations with UBC, Laval, and Sherbrooke, and then that led us to collaborating with to see if we can use the wearable sensors to track brace wear time, and that we have received funding from the Bone and Joint Institute, and we're hoping that to conduct a CIHR funded trial, which will involve other sites such as Dalhousie as well as UBC. So in addition to some of the things that we are hoping to achieve with those studies, there are also future opportunities with the wearable sensors. So firstly, they do provide objective metrics. So not just the brace wear time or step count, but also other gait characteristics. And also they offer opportunities to combine wearables data with machine learning to infer kinematics and kinetics. There's also possibilities of app development where we have a brace smart app interaction. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Harvi. I think it might be best if we actually save questions for both of you, because I think there's probably some overlap based on the topics, I think, and some of the collaborations. So let's hold all our questions for the end, and we'll go right into Jesse's talk. So Jesse, we'll have you share your screen. Fantastic. All right, so our second speaker today is Dr. Jesse Charlton. Dr. Charlton is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Biomedical Engineering. He completed his PhD also at the University of British Columbia, but in the, I believe, Department of Physical Therapy. Dr. Charlton's research focuses on the biomechanical consequences of musculoskeletal diseases and the use of movement modifications to improve clinical and biomechanical outcomes. He uses wearable sensor devices to monitor movement in real-world environments to characterize locomotion in these complex settings and understand how people integrate movement modification into their daily activity. His current work, his postdoctoral work at UBC, is in designing wearable and mobile systems to measure movement biomechanics and couple them with experimental pain models in real time. And his work's been funded by Canadian Institutes of Health Research and currently by the Michael Smith Health Research Group in BC and the National Science and Engineering Research Council in Canada. His talk today is entitled Technology-Enabled Gait Monitoring and Modification, Managing Knee Osteoarthritis in the Wild.
Awesome. Thank you, Derek. I really appreciate that. Thank you to the Bone and Joint Institute for allowing me to jump in on this presentation today and share some of my work. I'm going to take a slightly different angle at some of this and focus in on movement modification for knee osteoarthritis and some of the applications of wearables that I've used. So instead of looking at some of the studies that are coming down the pipe, these are ones that we've conducted over the last several years. So I'll just jump in here. Perhaps. There we go. So I won't spend too much time on this. I think I don't need to introduce osteoarthritis to this group, but just briefly, in case you want a refresher, generally osteoarthritis can be characterized by a structural component. Typically see this with changes in bone, cartilage, ligaments. Really, we think of this as a degeneration of the joint as a whole or as an organ. But of course, it's also an illness and it's multifactorial. There's a lot of components that lead into the experience of osteoarthritis-related pain and how this can then impact your ability to participate in activities that you enjoy and often lowers physical function and health-related quality of life. And so really, we need to find ways to address both of these components so we can improve people's lives and allow them to continue doing the things that they enjoy. Now, the knee adduction moment is one component, one mechanical component at least, that's related to both the disease and the illness factors of osteoarthritis. So just again, as a refresher, I know Harvi mentioned this previously, it's generally predominantly the product of the ground reaction force in the frontal plane and the moment arm, about the center of rotation of the knee. And this is countered then internally by soft tissue, but also compression of that medial compartment. And so we think of this as something of a proxy for joint load, or at least the distribution of joint load across the tibiofemoral joint. And when we measure it during gait, we typically see this double hump pattern. We're probably all very familiar with this. We have an early cam peak in the early stance, cam 2 and later stance. And then the area under that curve, we call that the cam impulse. So we know that higher cam is certainly related to faster structural progression, and we've had a number of studies over the years that have all pointed in this direction, showing that higher baseline knee adduction moments prospectively are related to changes in structural outcomes like joint space narrowing and cartilage volume loss. A recent systematic review suggests that higher knee adduction moments are related to about a 2 to 3.5 increased odds of experiencing progression. It's also related to symptoms, though the relationships are maybe less strong, maybe more varied. But we do have studies here as well showing that higher knee adduction moments can be related to experiencing pain or the risk of experiencing pain during exercise like walking. So a study by Birmingham et al. Showed that there was about a 2.5 to 6.5 increased odds of experiencing pain from higher knee adduction moments, particularly if you're in that highest quartile of the knee adduction moments. So this suggests again that higher cam is linked to structural progression and experiencing knee OA-related pain. For that reason, it's generally been a therapeutic target from a biomechanics perspective. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can modify the knee adduction moment, gait modification being one, and within that umbrella, changing the foot progression angle or the angle of your foot with respect to the direction of walking is probably the most well-studied. So what we're talking about here is a toe-in pattern or toe-in FPA, is when you internally rotate the foot, and toe out would be an external rotation of the foot, as you can see on the graph here. So what this does to the knee adduction moment is if we're walking normally, we have a double hump pattern again. in the adduction moment. And when we perform a toe-in pattern, or what's maybe more better characterized as a heel-out pattern, we see a reduction in that early stance peak. Then if we toe out, we tend to see a reduction in this later stance peak. And for the most part, we see a dose response effect. The greater you change the rotation of your foot, the greater the reductions in CAM, depending on the outcome that you're looking at. And this can range from about 11 to a 92% reduction in knee adduction moment outcomes, depending on the population. We know that people with knee osteoarthritis can perform these modifications quite feasibly, and they can learn them. And generally, most of the studies in the past have used some type of biofeedback, be it a full-blown motion capture system, some type of wearable, or perhaps just a simple mirror. If we look at the short-term effects, several clinical trials have studied foot progression angle modifications between 6 and 16 weeks. And people generally end up with about 2 to 9 degrees of change from their baseline. And when we look at comparing treatment groups who are performing toe out or toe in modifications with a control group, we see conflicting evidence for improvements in pain, but lower knee adduction moments at follow-up by about 9 to 22%. So there's a number of advantages to changing foot progression angle as a therapeutic target. There's a therapy. We can integrate it into your daily walking activity, and it doesn't necessarily preclude you from getting other treatments like education or exercise or perhaps even a brace. It's cheap in some senses. Obviously, we don't know exactly how cheap it could be if we truly implement it in the clinic, but in theory it is. And it lowers CAM with minimal changes to the knee flexion moment, which can also contribute to that actual joint load. Unfortunately, we only see about 10% reductions in the knee adduction moment on average, and that's maybe not quite enough. We're not entirely sure what the threshold would be to be clinically meaningful just yet. And it's voluntary. People have to actually do the thing instead of having something like a brace or a wedge, which is just going to be there and perform that mechanical effect for you without you having to do anything. And then we don't know the long-term effects or what really happens when people leave the laboratory. And so this leaves us with a couple remaining questions. Firstly, can we actually measure foot progression angle out of the laboratory? Typically, it's always been done in controlled laboratory environments. Then if we can we measure how people actually modify their walking in the real world? And can they do this over a long period of time in their natural walking environments? And then do we need to use real-time biofeedback and in-person visits, which have been typical in most gait modifications programs to date? Or could we give something that's a little bit more personalized and self-directed? And then lastly, what ultimately happens to joint load in the real world? So my previous studies, as part of my previous studies, I co-developed this wearable sensor system that embeds inside of a shoe. It's a 9-axis IMU. It samples acceleration, angular rate, and magnetic data at 100 Hertz. And it stores it on an onboard micro SD chip. It has wireless charging, and it can run for about 16 hours collecting in one go. So it embeds in the shoe. People can wear this in any environment. It allows us to measure toe in and toe out angles using a magnetometer-free algorithm that we developed. So the first step with this was to ensure that the sensor system can validly and reliably measure foot progression angle. For any of you who's interested, the next few slides will have a little QR code in the top right there. You're welcome to scan that and go check out the paper, the preprint associated with this slide. So on the left here, we have the Bland-Altman plot. This is 20 healthy adults who wore the shoe during outdoor walking and then wore the shoe during indoor laboratory walking. Laboratory walking was motion capture with markers. It's kind of our gold standard. We saw about a 2.2 bias, 2.2 degree bias. That was significant. When we remove that outlier in the bottom left corner, that shifts up a little bit closer to 0, and it's no longer significant. We then performed the same collection, real world and in laboratory about a week later, and we saw very good reliability with measuring foot progression angle, ICCs well above 0.9, and a minimum detectable change of 2.7 degrees, which is great given that we're typically aiming for modifications or looking for modifications of the foot progression angle well above 5 or 6 degrees. So I then wanted to figure out how much data we actually needed to collect in the real world. In laboratories, we tend to think 3 or 5 steps from a motion capture lab is potentially sufficient. You may or may not agree with that, but we don't really know how much we need to be collecting in the real world to kind of give us the same confidence in this data. So I had 30 participants with and without knee osteoarthritis take the sensor home for a week. They walked with it in their natural environments, just their normal patterns. And then I performed a statistical modeling technique where I gathered increasing numbers of steps together into a larger and larger distribution of their data until the point where adding extra steps to their data really didn't change the outcomes. So we could say it was self-similar. And as that similarity begins to curve upwards and plateau, we call this the consistency point. So adding more data beyond that point really wouldn't change those outcomes. As we wanted to see how many steps it took to get to that point for each person and for various outcomes. And we looked at the foot strike angle and the foot progression angle. These are the ones I'm going to show you here today. We had a few others in the actual paper. It should be out quite soon in IEEE. And we see there's about 650 steps to reach that consistency point for foot strike angle at heel strike, and about 980 for the foot progression angle. And we really didn't see any differences between the two healthy adult and the osteoarthritis groups. So to put this in different terms, this means about 17 minutes of walking in the real world if we consider about a 58 step per minute cadence on one side. So we then wanted to characterize what is going on in the real world, how people's natural foot progression angle looks in the real world. So we really don't have that data. So you can see here on the left, these distributions are two individuals. As steps were accumulated and collected in the real world, you can see they begin to tighten up around that red line. And that red line is the in-lab median, the one that we measured with the sensor while they were walking on a treadmill, which would be the kind of the most consistent and controlled environment that we might have in a typical gait study. Again, on the right-hand side, we have the median foot progression angle. This was 45 participants with and without knee osteoarthritis. Walking on the treadmill, we saw around 10 degrees as the median FPA, and then in the real world, it was about the same. And so this again shows really consistent differences between in-lab measurements and out-of-lab measurements. We also wanted to look at how consistent real-world data was across bouts of data, because people don't just walk in one block while they're out in their daily life. They walk for an hour a day, half hour a day, what have you, over time. So we took all of the bouts of data that participants provided to us and looked at the consistency across those bouts for the foot progression angle. We found very high ICCs again, well above 0.9, almost 0.9, or almost 1.0. And the minimum detectable change was about 2.3 degrees. On the right-hand side, we see some distributions here. And these are each bout going down the chart of participants' foot progression angle data from the entire week. We then calculated their median and then centered all of their data about that median. And so this is median-centered foot progression angle. And we can see that the fluctuation around a given person's median is really only about plus or minus 2 degrees, telling us that, again, it's quite consistent. It's quite a patterned motion that people perform, even in the complexities of real-world walking. So with all that out of the way, we then wanted to take this and implement it in more of a clinically relevant situation. And we did this through a clinical trial. This is a pilot feasibility trial. I was looking at gait modification for knee osteoarthritis, and it had 4 key innovations from previous studies. First, we individualized the foot progression angle, be it toe in or toe out, and this was based on a pre-screen. So we determined which pattern would maximize the reduction in CAM for a given person, and that's what they received. They were then told to toe out or toe in as much as is comfortable instead of a single target, which has been quite typical of past trials. The participants didn't perform any in-person real-time biofeedback of any kind. We simply told them toe in or toe out as much as is comfortable. And then we had 5 weekly video conferencing appointments over the duration of the 6-week intervention. And then they wore the same sensorized shoe that I demonstrated earlier across the entire intervention so we could track their progress. This is just the pre-post component of this study, the flow on the right-hand side here. We had 20 participants with KL 2 to 4 and pain greater than 3 on an NRS from 0 to 10. So they went through their baseline assessment, did their 6-week intervention follow-up, and then a 10-week retention point. So looking at the feasibility component first, we had a great respondent to our advertisements, and we had no loss to follow-up and 100% attendance at all of the telehealth sessions, which was great. We also didn't have any major adverse events. By the end of the study, participants reported 8.6 out of 10 in confidence in performing the modification that they were provided. And 75% of respondents were satisfied with the general effects of the intervention on their knee pain and function, and 100% were satisfied with the convenience of the telehealth model that we provided. Now looking at some of the performance results based on the sensor data, this graph shows on the y-axis the absolute change in the progression angle from their baseline data. And then each one of these box and whisker plots represents a 2-week block of data. So week 1 and 2, week 3 and 4, week 5 and 6, and then follow-up and retention where participants walking around the hallways outside of a laboratory. The dots, green and red, are just the toe in and toe out participants that they are designating what the participant's modification was. And the size of the dot is simply just a relative variability measurement. So we can see here that there's an increase in that foot progression angle over time, which is great. That's what we expect. Perhaps a little bit of a Hawthorne effect going on in the follow-up when the research was present, asking them to walk around the hallway. We see a greater increase in that foot progression angle compared to the final weeks of the actual intervention. And then, of course, a little bit of a regression there at the retention time point. So if we then go into the clinical and biomechanical results, this is again just pre-post from baseline, follow-up, and the retention time point. The changes in NRS pain during walking, were akin to what we've seen in previous interventions like this, around 40 and 50%. And then the knee adduction moment impulse change was 12% at follow-up, and that was halved at retention. We didn't see any changes in the knee flexion moment impulse. It was pretty static across the entire study. So I think what this shows us is that wearable devices give us some new insight into what we can measure in the real world. And in particular, it gives us an idea of what people are doing when they actually leave the clinic or the laboratory. Additionally, with telehealth, we know that this is actually feasible and we can get people to change their movement using this remote care, which hadn't really been shown before. People liked it and found it quite convenient. If we knit this together with an individualized and self-directed approach to delivering gait modification, I think there's a lot of potential here to increase our ability to deliver this care. So now I want to talk about some of the limitations. The sensorized shoe that we used had a sensor buried inside of the sole of the shoe. And of course, this means that participants had to wear our shoes. They weren't necessarily comfortable for everybody. Fit was a bit of a trouble. And we know that people who have sore knees, sore feet, or what have you, probably have particular shoes that they would prefer to wear. So if we can have the sensor fixed on the outside of the shoe, be it under the laces or elsewhere, this could give us the opportunity for people to wear their own shoes. But we do have to get around this calibration issue. We need a way to automatically calibrate the sensor whenever it's donned onto the shoe again. Now, Harvey talked a little bit about this, the terrain. What are people doing what are these measurements when people are walking on different terrains? This is some preliminary data I collected with some physical therapy students during their year-long research project. And what we see here is a foot progression angle median, or magnitude, on the y-axis under different terrain conditions, and is generally fairly stable for the most part. It definitely does change during stair descent. We see an increase toward toe out when people are walking down the stairs. So this may be something to consider. And then, as I mentioned, the last question there was what happens to joint load? And my previous studies really didn't address this yet. And it's part because we're still developing ways to understand how we can estimate joint load and do it accurately in the real world. And so I just wanted to highlight two studies here, one from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, where they're using smartphones and IMUs to couple together to estimate joint kinetics during walking. And then another study that recently came out from Snyder et al. Using a pressure-sensitive insole to quite accurately measure the knee adduction moment during gait. So to wrap up, I just wanted to point out that I do think lab-bound research is certainly valuable, but I think we can do more with less if we are creative with how we apply these sensor systems. And wearables also allow us to shine some light on areas that we haven't really been able to explore and understand and are really critical to our patients' daily lives. If we use self-directed and remote care, we might have the potential to increase the reach of things like gait modification and help more people with knee osteoarthritis. And using this real-world kind of tech-driven research is fantastic, and we've done lots over the last 20, 30 years, but I think there's a lot more to do for us to get this into the hands of patients and really change their lives. So with that, I'll thank you. Thank the Bone and Joint Institute and the Canadian MSK Rehab Research Network and all the collaborators that helped support the work that I presented today.
All right, fantastic. So we definitely have some time, about 15 minutes or so for questions for both Dr. Charlton and Dr. Hart. So feel free to ask those. I'm kind of monitoring, looking for any raised hands and anything in the chat as well. I'll kind of get us started. And one of the questions actually, Jesse, you really led me to at the very end. And I wondered if you would get to this, because when I was listening to Harvi talk about the outcomes that they were measuring in those studies with IMUs mounted to the ankle versus the hip, and then your studies that are measuring foot progression angle, yet you rationalized all of this by talking about the CAM. And it didn't seem like the CAM was really being measured. And so, are we really measuring, do we have the capability to measure the things that are most strongly associated with knee osteoarthritis right now? Because when we measure total number of steps versus when we measure CAM, I think sometimes perhaps we have a different interpretation on the role of loading in osteoarthritis progression. And so can you comment on, that a little further on what you think on what we're measuring right now with these different devices?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I intentionally kind of left that to the end because my studies didn't measure it. It's kind of an open question still. We're measuring indirectly what we think is related to the knee adduction moment, which is the modification of that foot progression angle. And so we're taking that kinematic approach, but it doesn't tell us what the direct link is to the actual thing that we think is an indirect link to the changes in progression, both structurally and from pain. So the research that is coming out now, I think we're getting closer to being able to estimate the knee adduction moment in real world settings day by day, but it's still not quite there yet. We need multiple sensors. It seems like pressure sensitive insoles are probably the best way to go right now, but I think there's people working on ways that we can just use an inertial measurement unit. And there's some talk about potentially doing some of that work with a colleague of mine at University of British Columbia. So we're hoping to get to a point where perhaps best case scenario, a single sensor on the shoe can get us a pretty decent estimate, but we're going to need lots and lots of data because these algorithms are very, very data hungry. So hopefully we'll get there, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah. Dr. Holdsworth?
Hi, thanks Harvi and Jesse. It's great to catch up. I've been really excited to be involved in this, at least on the technical side. And, for all of us, I think it's been exciting, but also a little frustrating. I can see what the manufacturers go through now because we had supply chain issues and the devices are obsolete almost by the time you get them in your hands. And but at the same time, it's very exciting because, some of the new devices we're looking at have machine learning cores built into the IMU directly, and it could give us the possibility to do some of the classification right on these chips. So it's really an exciting field to be in. I guess something specific I've been thinking, Harvi, and we've talked about this before. I mean, I really love the application for adherence, which I think we're going to have in so many different areas of our research programs. And people online are probably thinking, oh, I could use an adherence monitor on my device. But it also, of course, strikes me that people will change their behavior even if they think they're being monitored, like it'd be different. I don't know how to do that blindly, but, people who believe that you're tracking their activity are probably going to perform your therapy more reliably.
Right. So I guess something that's interesting is, so a few years ago, I was working on a study which was using Fitbits to track people's steps. So what we found initially was, initially when they were wearing the devices, they were actually getting lots of steps in, but over time they stopped or not started decreasing their number of steps. So maybe sure, initially, if you have a 6 month brace intervention or exercise intervention, maybe initially they may do them or adhere to them more just because they feel like they're being monitored. And then I guess eventually they kind of just will fall back to their usual habits if those behaviors aren't targeted. And those are my thoughts, I guess.
I might also add, there's been some fun work out of, I think it was out of Melbourne, where they sent ankle weights home as part of an exercise program that had IMUs embedded in them. And so they're able to discreetly track adherence to the exercise. And it was eye-opening, I think, to say the least, looking at the results of the study. And that could be potentially one component you could think about, is not necessarily saying that you have accelerometers in there looking at adherence, but certainly some ethical considerations to be had there too.
When you say eye-opening, lower adherence than one would have imagined?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a long discussion. We can talk about more at length later. But I mean, I'm worried that a large fraction of the therapies that we prescribe to people aren't done. And then we conclude that they're not effective, but maybe just not effective because they didn't do it.
Yeah. Anne-Marie?
Hi, thanks so much. Thank you both for the great talk. I had a question for Jesse. I've been more in the classification space, and I guess you mentioned a little bit how we're seeing some variation with different activities. But my question is more, I guess we understand the CAM really well from a straight walking perspective. And I'm wondering if you, as we're inferring this based on the steps that are being taken, if you have a sense of a threshold of like, when is enough good enough? Like maybe it doesn't matter that they're doing some other activities, but is there a period of time during the day that if they're walking straight and in a different foot progression, that it is tilting the balance towards being beneficial?
I'm not entirely sure I totally understand your question. So kick me back onto the road if I stray.
Yeah.
The approach that I took at the very least was taking the entire data set that I had from a given person, and I built a classification to try and identify when they were truly walking and not half stepping, say, at a light waiting to cross the street, or tapping their foot or what have you, or making large changes in direction, 180 degrees or 90 degrees or what have you. And so effectively any step that was reasonably linear, looked like regular walking, was considered. And I think, to me, that's what we're looking for. It's not necessarily go out and do 20 minutes of linear walking up and down a sidewalk and we consider that changing load. I mean, it is exercise and that's great. But really with these wearables, I think the idea is we want to try and get as much of that activity in general, and anything that looks like walking in there, I think we can start considering how we could classify or estimate various kinetics that we might be interested in. And that would give us a lot of information that we just frankly don't have right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a sense of how much of the data, I guess, then parsed into being straight walking?
Oh gosh, it's been a while since I've looked at those data.
It's okay.
It was fairly high. Like I'm shooting from the hip, but it was over 65-70% of data that was considered in my algorithms. That doesn't necessarily mean it was perfectly linear, but it looked like reasonably linear walking.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
I think there's two in the chat there, Derek.
Two in the chat. All right, so question for Dr. Hart. Mentioned that increased cadence may reduce risk of osteoarthritis progression. And has there been any work done or planned work to track adherence to changes in cadence in the real world? So that's first question. And as follow-up to that is related, is there a maximum amount to increase in cadence before participants become less likely to change, to adhere to that change? So is there almost a ceiling effect where you can't make people step any quicker?
Right. So I guess like the first part of the question, I am currently working on a small study to sort of taking the work that I've done in a lab to change cadence to outside, looking at a 6-week program to change cadence. For that one, I have been using just the app that's available, Map My Walk or Map My Run, to be able to just track their cadence while they're walking. So that's what I've kind of been using to more see how, I guess, how whether they're meeting that prescribed cadence. So the second part of the question was, just regarding the adherence to change, how likely. So in my work, so I've used 10. Initially, I had said 10 to 20%. That's what I was going to try, but I found that for most people, 10% was all they could kind of manage, and it also kind of depends on what their preferred cadences. So if they're walking at a lower cadence, they're probably likely to increase their cadence a little bit more, depending on things like pain and other things. But if someone's already walking at a much higher cadence, it's going to be really, really difficult for them to increase it. If you're walking at 120, 125, and increasing it by a further 20%, it's probably easier for them to run at that point.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that question from Ryan. Ryan, some of our work with runners says the same thing, and that's that cadence manipulation does ceiling out, especially if you are already at a high cadence, for sure. Another question here for Dr. Hart. Which algorithm or methodology did you use to extract the gait parameters from the inertial sensors? So is that something maybe customized, or is that commercially available? Or
Sure. So both of the studies are kind of still in the planning phases, so we're still kind of figuring things out. So with the actographs, they obviously have their own commercial software, but we have been working. So our team members also include software engineers. So from University of Sherbrooke, we do have a colleague who they've created a software. It's called OpenIMU software. So we've kind of been just playing around with that to see if that's something that we could use both for actograph as well as the IMU, but we haven't quite, we don't have a concrete plan at this point.
David, we've got time for one more. So give it to you.
Yeah, it's more of just a follow-on comment to that. It's a good question, and it's a moving target. And so I'll just make another note for everyone, because it's been newer information for me that the most recent generation of these chips have intelligence on board to detect simple things like steps and step count. And now they have machine learning cores that you can program to recognize specific activities. And we're also looking at really low power convolutional neural network chips that could do a whole, machine learning implementation right on a chip. So, wow, it's a really exciting area, but it means that you may have a different methodology in 6 months than you do now.
Yeah, fantastic point. And every time I hear about wearables, I feel like the research that's being done, there's already a new wearable by the time I'm reading it that we're studying. So you're right, moving target for sure. So that does bring us to 3 o'clock. So just want to thank everybody for their participation, and for our two speakers, Dr. Charlton. We are doing this over Zoom, but he is currently in London visiting us. So thank you for traveling out here as well. So thank you for your attendance. Have a fantastic weekend, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Take care.